August 3, 1944. James Thornton stood before a panel of Army Transport Command officers in a Detroit warehouse that smelled of motor oil and bureaucratic dismissal, clutching blueprints they'd already mentally discarded. The grease under his fingernails marked him as what he was, a mechanic, not an engineer, and in the rigid hierarchy of wartime procurement, that distinction meant everything. His hands trembled not from nervousness but from exhaustion. He'd worked 17-hour shifts for 3 months perfecting modifications to the standard 2.5-ton cargo truck. The vehicle soldiers simply called Deuce and a Half, convinced he'd solved the supply crisis that was strangling General Patton's advance across France. "Mr. Thornton," Colonel Harrison Whitmore began, his tone already dismissive as he gestured toward the technical drawings spread across the table. "We appreciate civilian enthusiasm for the war effort, but military logistics isn't repaired by backyard tinkering." The other officers nodded, their expressions a uniform mixture of impatience and condescension. Thornton had heard variations of this speech 5 times in the past 6 weeks, from 5 different procurement offices, each rejecting what they called his unproven modifications to proven military hardware. The Army had invested millions in existing truck designs. Why would they gamble on improvements suggested by someone who'd spent his career fixing farm equipment and city buses? What these officers couldn't know, what their comfortable positions in stateside planning offices prevented them from understanding, was that Thornton's eldest son, Michael, drove supply trucks for the Red Ball Express, the massive convoy system desperately pushing ammunition, fuel, and rations toward Allied forces racing across liberated France. Michael's letters home, when they arrived weeks late through military postal channels, painted a picture drastically different from the optimistic reports circulating through command headquarters. He wrote about trucks breaking down every 30 miles, about convoys delayed for hours waiting for repairs, about critical supplies never reaching frontline units because the vehicles carrying them couldn't handle the punishment of bombed-out French roads and around-the-clock operation. "Colonel," Thornton interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice, "my modifications aren't theoretical. I've tested them on civilian trucks running similar routes under comparable conditions." This wasn't entirely true. Detroit's potholes, however severe, couldn't replicate European war zones. But desperation made evangelists of ordinary men. He pointed to specific sections of his blueprints: reinforced suspension components, modified fuel delivery systems, enhanced cooling mechanisms designed specifically for the continuous operation that Red Ball Express drivers endured. "The standard Deuce and a Half breaks down because it wasn't designed for what we're asking it to do. It's a cargo truck being used like a combat vehicle." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, exchanging glances with his fellow officers that Thornton couldn't interpret. According to military historian Gerald Astor's work, The Greatest War, documented in his comprehensive analysis of World War II logistics, the Red Ball Express would eventually transport over 412,000 tons of supplies to advancing Allied forces. But in early August 1944, the operation teetered on collapse beneath the weight of mechanical failures and insufficient planning. The trucks were dying faster than factories could replace them. "We have engineers, Mr. Thornton," another officer said, his nameplate reading Major Vincent Callahan. "Educated men with degrees from top technical schools. If these modifications were viable, don't you think they would have proposed them?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, carrying within it all the class divisions that peacetime had temporarily suspended, but wartime bureaucracy enthusiastically maintained. Mechanics fixed things, engineers designed them. That Thornton had crossed this boundary seemed to offend Callahan more than any potential flaw in the proposed modifications. Thornton gathered his blueprints, preparing for another rejection, when the warehouse door opened. Captain Robert Hastings entered the Detroit warehouse like a man who'd forgotten what sleep felt like, his uniform bearing the dust of French roads and the particular exhaustion that came from watching good soldiers die from preventable failures. Unlike the procurement officers arrayed around the table, Hastings commanded a Red Ball Express transportation company, 300 trucks, 600 drivers, mechanics, and support personnel, and he'd flown back to the States specifically to address what he termed in his official report as catastrophic mechanical failure rates that exceed combat losses in frontline infantry units. His presence altered the room's atmosphere immediately. Whitmore straightened in his chair. Callahan set down the coffee he'd been nursing, and Thornton stopped gathering his rejected blueprints. "Captain Hastings," Whitmore began, clearly surprised by the interruption. "We weren't expecting you until this afternoon's general briefing." The scheduled meeting would cover supply chain statistics, casualty reports, and progress assessments, the sanitized data that allowed officers in comfortable headquarters to convince themselves they understood what was happening 3,000 miles away in European combat zones. Hastings had attended enough of these briefings to know they bore little resemblance to the reality his drivers faced every day. "I need to see those blueprints," Hastings said. Ignoring the colonel's greeting and gesturing toward the papers, Thornton was sliding back into a battered leather portfolio. The mechanic hesitated, glancing at Whitmore for permission that the colonel grudgingly granted with a slight nod. Hastings spread the technical drawings across the table again, his eyes moving rapidly across Thornton's modifications, the reinforced axle assemblies, the enhanced oil filtration system, the reconfigured gear ratios that promised better performance under sustained high-load operation. Unlike the procurement officers who'd examined these same drawings minutes earlier with skeptical detachment, Hastings studied them like someone trying to identify lifeboats on a sinking ship. "Where did you get your failure rate data?" Hastings asked Thornton directly, tapping a section of the blueprint that addressed transmission durability. The question surprised everyone in the room because it assumed the data existed, that Thornton's modifications emerged from systematic analysis rather than inspired guesswork. Thornton pulled a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and technical specifications copied from his son's letters. Michael had documented every breakdown, every delay, every mechanical failure that plagued his convoy routes between Normandy beaches and forward positions approaching the German border. "My son drives for the 348th Transportation Company," Thornton explained, his voice carrying a new confidence that came from finally speaking with someone who understood the urgency behind his work. "He's been cataloging failures since D-Day, sending me specifications when sensors allow it." The notebook contained 6 months of meticulous observations from someone with limited technical training, but intimate knowledge of how trucks actually failed under combat conditions. Michael had noticed patterns that escaped the engineers designing vehicles in peaceful Detroit factories. The specific mileage points where transmissions degraded, the temperature ranges where cooling systems proved inadequate, the road conditions that destroyed suspension components designed for American highways. Hastings read through several pages of Michael's observations, occasionally marking passages with a pencil he'd borrowed from Thornton. The procurement officers watched this interaction with visible discomfort, allowing field observations to influence established procurement procedures violated the proper channels through which military equipment was evaluated and adopted. "Major Callahan," Hastings said without looking up from the notebook, "how many trucks did we lose last week to mechanical failure?" The question seemed innocuous, but Thornton noticed Callahan's jaw tighten before he answered. "The official report indicates 63 vehicles categorized as temporarily disabled." Callahan read from a file folder, emphasizing temporarily as though the word made the situation less catastrophic. Hastings finally looked up from Thornton's notebook, his expression suggesting he was calculating figures in his head that didn't match the official statistics. "Captain," Whitmore interjected, clearly sensing where this conversation was heading, "battlefield maintenance has always been challenging. These are acceptable loss rates given operational circumstances. I lost 89 trucks last week, Colonel," Hastings said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone reporting facts rather than arguing opinions. 89 trucks that my mechanics couldn't repair quickly enough to maintain convoy schedules. That's not temporarily disabled. That's equipment failure costing us the war." The stark assessment silenced the room. According to records maintained by the U.S. Army Transportation Museum, as referenced in their official documentation of Red Ball Express operations, mechanical failures did indeed exceed official estimates by significant margins during summer operations in 1944, though exact figures remained classified until decades after the war's conclusion. Hastings turned back to Thornton. "Can you retrofit existing trucks, or do these modifications require factory installation?" The question acknowledged what the blueprint's creator had hoped someone would eventually understand, that his design wasn't theoretical but practical, not an academic exercise but an emergency solution to an immediate crisis. Thornton had designed his modifications specifically for field implementation, knowing that waiting for factory retooling would take months the Allied advance couldn't afford. September 7, 1944. Master Sergeant William Bull Henderson stood in a muddy French field outside Chartres, staring at 12 trucks Captain Hastings had somehow diverted from regular Red Ball Express rotation for what Henderson's orders vaguely described as field testing of enhanced mechanical configurations. The sergeant had spent 22 years in the Army, mostly in motor pools, and he'd learned that vague orders usually meant someone important was bypassing proper channels for reasons that would either prove brilliant or get everyone involved court-martialed. The trucks looked ordinary, standard deuce-and-a-half cargo vehicles, canvas-covered beds, government olive drab paint. But Henderson noticed details that didn't match factory specifications. Standing beside Henderson was James Thornton, the Detroit mechanic who'd convinced Hastings that his modifications could solve the mechanical plague destroying the Red Ball Express faster than German artillery. Thornton looked profoundly uncomfortable in the ill-fitting civilian contractor coveralls the Army had issued him. But his discomfort came less from unfamiliar clothing than from the realization that his theoretical improvements now faced practical testing under actual combat conditions. His son Michael was somewhere in this same region, driving one of the standard trucks these modifications were meant to save, a coincidence that felt less like fate than like unbearable pressure. "Mr. Thornton," Henderson said, his tone suggesting he'd shepherded many civilian contractors through the gap between theory and practice. "We've got 3 days to prove these modifications work before Colonel Whitmore pulls authorization and probably has both of us cleaning latrines until the war ends." The unauthorized nature of this experiment couldn't be overstated. Hastings had used emergency field commander authority to requisition the trucks and approve the modifications without formal procurement approval, gambling his career on a mechanic's blueprints and his own desperate conviction that something had to change. The modification process began immediately, with Henderson's team of mechanics working alongside Thornton under canvas tarps that provided minimal shelter from the September rain that turned French fields into soup. Each truck required approximately 18 hours of intensive work to install the reinforced suspension components, upgraded cooling systems, and modified transmission assemblies that Thornton insisted would triple operational reliability. The mechanics worked with the focused intensity of men who understood they were racing against both time and bureaucracy, occasionally glancing toward the horizon, where they could hear the distant thunder of artillery from German positions still contesting the Allied advance. Corporal James Washington, one of Henderson's most skilled mechanics and one of the thousands of African-American soldiers who comprised a majority of Red Ball Express drivers and support personnel, studied Thornton's modifications with particular interest. Washington had grown up in his father's garage in South Carolina, developing mechanical intuition that formal engineering education often missed, and he recognized in Thornton's designs the kind of practical innovation that emerged from actually fixing broken equipment rather than theoretically preventing failures. "This reinforcement here," Washington said, pointing to the modified suspension mounting, "this addresses the fracture point we've been welding every 200 miles. The observation pleased Thornton, who'd designed that specific modification based on Michael's detailed descriptions of the most common suspension failure. "Your standard deuce-and-a-half was designed for cargo hauling on maintained roads," Thornton explained to Washington and the other mechanics gathered around the first truck receiving modifications. "Nobody anticipated you'd be driving them 24 hours a day across bomb-damaged French infrastructure carrying loads that exceed design specifications." The mechanics nodded. They'd all improvised countless field repairs addressing these exact issues, but their solutions were temporary patches, not systematic improvements. By the evening of September 9th, all 12 trucks had received Thornton's complete modification package, and Henderson gathered his drivers, all experienced Red Ball Express veterans who'd volunteered for this experiment after Hastings promised them first access to any improvements that actually worked. The test protocol was straightforward and brutal. The modified trucks would run the standard Red Ball Express route from Chartres to Nancy, a distance of approximately 200 miles across some of the worst roads in liberated France, carrying maximum loads and maintaining the aggressive schedule that had been destroying standard trucks. Control trucks running the same route would provide comparison data. "Gentlemen," Henderson addressed his drivers, 12 men whose faces reflected the exhausting reality of Red Ball Express operations. "You're driving trucks that officially don't exist, carrying modifications that haven't been approved, on orders that will probably get everyone involved demoted." He paused, letting the weight of this unofficial experiment settle over them. "But if Mr. Thornton's right, we might save this operation and a lot of lives." According to documentation preserved in the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library, as cited in multiple historical analyses of Red Ball Express logistics, the supply operation indeed faced potential collapse during early September 1944 due to mechanical failure rates that exceeded replacement capacity. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American driver from California, who joined the Army partly to prove his patriotism to a country that barely recognized his citizenship, raised his hand before speaking. "Sir, what happens if these modifications fail catastrophically during the test run?" It was the question everyone had been avoiding. The nightmare scenario where Thornton's untested improvements didn't just fail to help, but actually made things worse, stranding drivers in hostile territory with trucks that couldn't be repaired using standard procedures. Henderson exchanged glances with Thornton before answering. "Then we figure it out. Same as we've been figuring everything else out since Normandy. September 10th, 1944, 0400 hours. The modified convoy departed Chartres under darkness, 12 trucks carrying ammunition and rations that forward units needed yesterday, their drivers navigating by the dim light of blackout headlamps designed to prevent German artillery from targeting nighttime movements. Robert Chen gripped his steering wheel with the particular tension that came from driving an experimental vehicle into combat conditions, acutely aware that the modifications beneath his truck represented either salvation or disaster with no middle ground. The truck felt different from standard models. The suspension responded more firmly to road irregularities. The engine note suggested better power distribution. But Chen had driven enough unreliable vehicles to know that initial impressions meant nothing until equipment faced sustained punishment. Behind Chen's truck, Private Eugene Davies from West Virginia wrestled his modified deuce-and-a-half through a section of road where German artillery had created craters that forced drivers onto muddy shoulders never designed for 5-ton vehicles. Davies had been driving Red Ball Express routes for 3 months, long enough to develop intimate knowledge of where standard trucks typically failed. This particular stretch usually destroyed at least one truck per convoy, generally through suspension failures that left vehicles tilted into ditches while drivers radioed for recovery vehicles that might arrive in hours or days. His modified suspension handled the punishment differently, still rough, still demanding constant attention, but without the catastrophic component failures that had become numbingly routine. James Thornton rode in the passenger seat of Master Sergeant Henderson's Jeep, following the convoy at a distance that allowed observation without interference. He'd argued strenuously for permission to accompany the test run, over Henderson's objections that civilian contractors didn't belong in active combat zones. Thornton had prevailed by pointing out that if his modifications failed, someone needed to observe exactly how and why they failed to enable rapid corrections. This logical argument concealed his deeper motivation. Michael's last letter had mentioned his unit was scheduled to run supplies toward Nancy this same week, and Thornton harbored the irrational hope that he might encounter his son somewhere along these devastated French roads. By dawn on September 10th, the convoy had covered 87 miles, and Henderson's radio crackled with reports from the control convoy running standard trucks on a parallel route. 2 control trucks had already broken down with transmission failures. One had blown a head gasket, and another had suffered suspension collapse while navigating the same cratered section that Davies had successfully traversed in his modified vehicle. The numbers told a story that even the most skeptical procurement officer couldn't dismiss. Thornton's modifications were working. The modified trucks weren't invincible. They still struggled with impossible roads and excessive loads, but they were surviving conditions that destroyed standard vehicles. "Mr. Thornton," Henderson said, his voice carrying cautious optimism as he compared status reports from both convoys. "I think you might have actually done something here." The sergeant had commanded motor pool operations through 2 theaters of war, and he'd watched countless promised improvements fail under combat testing. That Thornton's modifications survived their first 100 miles didn't guarantee long-term success, but it suggested the mechanic from Detroit had understood something that escaped formally trained engineers: how trucks actually failed under impossible conditions rather than how they theoretically should perform under test protocols. The convoy reached the halfway point at a supply depot near Verdun, where mechanics performed standard maintenance checks, while drivers grabbed coffee and whatever food the depot kitchen could provide. Corporal Washington examined Chen's truck with particular attention, crawling beneath the chassis to inspect stress points where standard trucks typically showed early failure indicators. "Sir," Washington called to Henderson, his voice carrying surprise that bordered on disbelief. "The suspension mounts are clean. No stress fractures, no premature wear, nothing that suggests imminent failure." This simple observation carried enormous implications. On standard trucks, these same mounts showed damage after 50 miles of Red Ball Express operation. Inside the depot's operations office, Henderson placed a radio call back to Captain Hastings, who'd remained at headquarters enduring what he described as professional consequences for authorizing unauthorized modifications. "Captain, you're going to want to hear this," Henderson reported, then provided detailed status updates comparing the modified convoy's performance against the control trucks. Hastings listened in silence before responding with a single question: "Can we retrofit the entire Red Ball Express fleet?" The question assumed success, jumping past whether Thornton's modifications worked to the infinitely more complex challenge of implementing them across thousands of trucks, scattered across hundreds of miles of French territory. As the convoy prepared to depart Verdun for the second half of their journey, a column of standard Red Ball Express trucks arrived for refueling, and Thornton saw him, Michael, climbing down from his deuce-and-a-half looking exhausted in the way that transcended physical tiredness into something closer to spiritual depletion. Father and son stared at each other across the muddy depot yard, separated by military protocol that didn't include provisions for mechanics encountering their children in combat zones. Michael recovered first, crossing the distance with steps that tried to maintain military bearing while his face betrayed emotions that 3 months of separation had intensified. "Dad," Michael said, the single word containing questions about how and why his father had materialized in a French supply depot. Thornton pulled his son into a brief embrace before explaining the test convoy, the modifications, the desperate experiment that had brought him across an ocean. Michael listened with the particular attention of someone whose survival might depend on understanding what he was being told, his mechanic's mind immediately grasping the significance of the improvements his father described. According to records maintained by the National Archives, as documented in their extensive collection of Red Ball Express operational reports, family connections between stateside support personnel and deployed soldiers occasionally created these extraordinary moments where personal relationships intersected with historical events. "Your letters saved this," Thornton told Michael quietly, aware that Henderson was giving them space but also watching the clock. "Everything you documented, every failure you recorded, that's what convinced them to test the modifications." September 15th, 1944. Colonel Harrison Whitmore sat in a commandeered French chateau that served as Transportation Corps headquarters, reading Captain Hastings' report on the unauthorized modification test, with an expression that suggested he was experiencing simultaneous relief and fury. The data was undeniable. 12 modified trucks had completed 6 round trips across punishing routes that typically disabled standard vehicles, at rates approaching 40%. Transmission failures had dropped to near zero. Suspension collapses had essentially disappeared, and cooling system problems that plagued standard trucks in around-the-clock operation had been virtually eliminated. Thornton's modifications worked spectacularly, which created an entirely new set of problems that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with military bureaucracy, procurement protocols, and a colonel's career. "Captain Hastings," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a superior officer addressing a subordinate who'd been simultaneously insubordinate and correct. You circumvented established procurement procedures, authorized modifications using parts that weren't in the supply system, and risked lives testing unproven designs without proper oversight. Each accusation was factually accurate, and each would normally justify court-martial proceedings. You also, Whitmore continued after a long pause, potentially saved the entire Red Ball Express operation. This second assessment was equally accurate, and it created a dilemma that neat military regulations didn't address: how to discipline an officer who'd violated protocol while solving an existential crisis. James Thornton stood beside Hastings in Whitmore's office, technically a civilian contractor but practically an accused co-conspirator in whatever military infractions Hastings had committed. Thornton had spent his life fixing things within established systems, respecting authority and following rules, but watching his son risk his life in failing equipment had transformed him into something he'd never expected to become: someone willing to break rules that didn't make sense. His hands, still bearing the grease stains that identified him as a mechanic rather than a policymaker, remained steady as Whitmore considered their fates. Major Vincent Callahan entered the office carrying another folder, his expression suggesting the bureaucratic complications were multiplying. "Colonel, we've received an urgent request from 3rd Army Headquarters," Callahan began, referring to General George Patton's command that was spearheading the Allied advance toward Germany. "They're asking why their supply deliveries improved dramatically this week and requesting immediate expansion of whatever changes we implemented." The request was simultaneously validating and damning. It confirmed Thornton's modifications worked while highlighting that unauthorized experiments were now affecting Army-level operations. Whitmore drummed his fingers on his desk, a gesture that Thornton recognized from their first meeting as indicating the colonel was calculating political rather than engineering solutions. The Transportation Corps existed within a vast bureaucracy where correct procedure often mattered more than correct results, where following proper channels provided protection that successful innovations couldn't guarantee. "Gentlemen," Whitmore finally said, addressing both Hastings and Thornton, "we have approximately 48 hours to transform an unauthorized field experiment into an official procurement initiative, complete with proper documentation, approval chains, and attribution that doesn't make everyone involved look like we're running the Army from a backyard garage." The solution Whitmore proposed was bureaucratic alchemy, retroactively creating the paper trail that should have preceded the modifications, bringing in Army engineers to formally validate Thornton's designs, and essentially rewriting the historical sequence so that proper procedures had been followed even though everyone in the room knew they hadn't been. Thornton listened to this plan with growing discomfort. His modifications worked because he'd ignored formal procedures that would have delayed implementation for months or killed the initiative entirely. Trying to legitimize his work through the same broken system that had initially rejected it felt like a betrayal of everything that had made it successful. "Colonel," Thornton interrupted, surprising himself with his boldness, "with respect, we don't have 48 hours for paperwork. We have approximately 3,000 trucks in the Red Ball Express system, most of them approaching the failure point where my modifications would make the most difference. Every day we spend creating documentation is another day drivers are risking their lives in equipment we know how to improve." His voice carried the conviction of someone who'd watched bureaucracy prioritize process over people long enough to stop caring about political consequences. Whitmore's expression suggested he was unaccustomed to civilian contractors lecturing him on military priorities. But before he could respond, Henderson entered the office without knocking, itself a violation of protocol that indicated something urgent. "Sir, we've got a situation," the sergeant reported. "Word about the modified trucks spread through the driver ranks, and we're getting requests from every company in the Red Ball Express for immediate retrofits. Drivers are threatening to refuse standard trucks if modified versions are available." The impromptu driver rebellion added yet another complication to an already impossible situation. According to military historian Charles Whiting's book, Patton's Last Battle, as documented in his analysis of Third Army logistics, supply chain tensions during September 1944 had indeed reached critical levels where driver morale and equipment reliability both threatened operational collapse. The Red Ball Express drivers, many of them African-American soldiers facing both combat dangers and military segregation, had developed their own informal communication networks that bypassed official channels, sharing information about anything that might improve their survival odds. "How many mechanics would we need?" Whitmore asked Henderson, his question indicating he was abandoning bureaucratic concerns for practical solutions to retrofit the entire Red Ball Express fleet in 2 weeks. The timeline was impossibly ambitious, requiring coordination across hundreds of miles of French territory, parts that didn't officially exist in the supply system, and mechanics who'd need training on modifications that hadn't been formally documented. Henderson calculated in his head, considering not just the mechanical work but the logistics of implementing mass modifications while maintaining continuous convoy operations. At least 200 mechanics working around the clock, Henderson estimated, plus parts fabrication capacity we don't currently have, and probably Mr. Thornton training teams, since he's the only person who fully understands these modifications. The requirements highlighted how thoroughly Thornton's one-man operation would need to scale to meet military demands. Converting 12 experimental trucks was a manageable weekend project. Retrofitting 3,000 trucks while they remained in active service represented an engineering and logistics challenge that rivaled the original vehicle production. Thornton thought about Detroit, about the machine shops he knew, about the manufacturing capacity sitting unused because military contracts went to established defense contractors who'd never considered that the best improvements might come from someone who'd spent his career fixing what engineers designed. September 22, 1944. The former Citroën factory on the outskirts of Paris had been hastily converted into what Corporal Washington privately called the most disorganized production line in military history, where French mechanics, American Army personnel, and civilian contractors led by James Thornton attempted to retrofit Red Ball Express trucks at a rate that would have seemed impossible if they weren't actually achieving it. Trucks rolled in carrying loads from the front lines, received their modifications while drivers slept or ate, and departed again within 16 hours, a turnaround time that violated every principle of careful mechanical work, but somehow produced functional improvements because everyone involved understood that perfection was the enemy of good enough. Washington supervised a team of 8 mechanics, a mix of experienced Army motor pool personnel and French civilians who'd worked at the factory before the war and returned to it afterward with skills that translated surprisingly well to military vehicle modification. The language barrier created constant communication challenges. Washington's high school French proved inadequate for technical discussions, and the French mechanic's English was limited to cognates that sometimes meant entirely different things. But they'd developed a hybrid vocabulary of gestures, drawings, and demonstrated procedures that worked better than formal documentation would have. Thornton moved between workstations like an anxious parent watching children perform a task he'd always done himself, offering corrections and encouragements in equal measure. His modifications, designed to be implemented carefully over days, were being installed in hours through a combination of prefabrication and aggressive assembly procedures that made him simultaneously proud and terrified. He'd taught teams of mechanics to specialize in specific modification components. One group handled suspension improvements, another focused on cooling system enhancements. A third team addressed transmission modifications, creating an assembly line approach to custom mechanical work. Mr. Thornton called out Sergeant Marie Dubois, a French Army mechanic who'd joined the operation after demonstrating that her understanding of automotive systems exceeded most of the American personnel. "We're seeing stress on the mounting brackets when we tighten to your specifications." She pointed to a section where Thornton's design assumed American steel specifications, but the replacement parts they'd fabricated using available French materials had slightly different properties. These small incompatibilities emerged constantly, requiring real-time design adjustments that formal engineering processes would have identified through months of testing. Thornton examined the problem, made quick calculations in his worn notebook, and proposed a solution that involved adding reinforcement washers and adjusting torque specifications. Simple fixes that would have been rejected in formal engineering reviews for lacking proper analysis, but which worked perfectly well in practice. This ability to improvise corrections without consulting reference manuals or approval chains had become Thornton's most valuable skill during the retrofit operation. He'd transformed from a single mechanic working alone in Detroit to a practical engineer leading an industrial operation, and the transition had happened so rapidly he barely recognized himself. By late September, the Paris factory had processed over 300 trucks, with another 6 temporary modification centers established across France, handling additional volume. Master Sergeant Henderson coordinated the entire network through radio communications that violated proper military frequencies, but got information where it needed to go faster than official channels. He'd created what military historians would later recognize as an unprecedented logistics operation within a logistics operation, using the Red Ball Express infrastructure to improve the Red Ball Express itself, a meta-level coordination challenge that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Captain Hastings appeared at the factory on September 25th, looking notably more relaxed than during his last visit, despite the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he still wasn't sleeping much. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled mechanics during a brief break in operations, Colonel Whitmore received a personal commendation from General Eisenhower's headquarters, acknowledging the Transportation Corps' initiative in implementing field modifications that improved supply chain reliability by 43%. The political translation was transparent. What had been unauthorized modifications 3 weeks earlier were now an official success that everyone wanted to claim credit for. Thornton listened to Hastings' announcement with mixed feelings. He was genuinely pleased his modifications were helping, that drivers like his son Michael were safer because trucks were more reliable, that the Allied advance was being sustained by equipment he'd designed. But the bureaucratic appropriation of his work, the way his desperate improvisation was being retrofitted with proper documentation and credit that flowed toward people who'd initially rejected his ideas, felt like another layer of injustice built into systems that claimed to value merit, but actually rewarded rank and credentials. According to research compiled by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, as documented in their official volume, The Logistics of War, the Red Ball Express would ultimately deliver over 12,000 tons of supplies daily at its operational peak, sustaining Allied armies as they pushed toward Germany through the fall and winter of 1944. The statistical summaries never mentioned James Thornton by name, attributing improvements to Transportation Corps technical innovations that made it seem like the modifications emerged from proper military engineering rather than a mechanic's blueprints. "Mr. Thornton," Washington said quietly during the same break, "my cousin drives for the 503rd Company. He said your modifications are the difference between completing runs and breaking down halfway. I wanted you to know that matters more than whatever the colonels say." The private acknowledgement from someone who actually understood both the mechanical improvements and the lives they affected meant more to Thornton than official commendations ever could. He nodded his thanks, unable to trust his voice to respond without revealing emotions that wartime professionalism required him to suppress. Michael Thornton arrived at the Paris factory that evening, driving one of the standard trucks scheduled for retrofit. Father and son had managed brief encounters twice since their initial meeting at Verdun, snatched conversations between convoy runs where they'd tried to compress months of separation into minutes of hurried updates. This visit was different. Michael would remain at the factory overnight while his truck received modifications, giving them actual time together in a war that generally prevented such luxuries. "Dad," Michael said after Thornton had finished supervising the initial assessment of his truck, "guys in my company are calling the modified trucks Thornton's tanks, because they're so much more reliable than standard vehicles. They don't know it's actually you, they just know some mechanic named Thornton designed improvements that actually work." October 8, 1944. James Thornton stood in a formal briefing room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, surrounded by Army engineers, procurement officers, and military brass, whose uniforms carried enough decorative brass and ribbons to stock a hardware store. He'd been summoned to present his modifications to what Captain Hastings had described as the people who make decisions that affect millions. Though Thornton suspected he'd been invited less to present, and more to provide visible evidence that the Transportation Corps was listening to practical field innovations. His discomfort in this setting went beyond his ill-fitting civilian suit to a fundamental recognition. that he didn't belong among people who made war from conference rooms rather than motor pools. Colonel Whitmore introduced him with a speech that carefully reframed the entire modification history, describing a collaborative process between Transportation Corps engineers and skilled civilian contractors that had produced significant improvements in vehicle reliability. The narrative was technically accurate while being fundamentally dishonest, transforming Thornton's rejected proposals and unauthorized experiments into an orderly development process that had never actually occurred. Thornton listened to his own story being rewritten in real time, watching bureaucracy absorb his disruption and package it as institutional success. "Mr. Thornton," began Brigadier General Clarence Brooks, a logistics officer who'd spent the war coordinating supply operations from headquarters offices, "your technical contributions have been valuable, but we need to discuss implementation challenges." The general's tone suggested he was about to explain problems to someone who didn't fully understand them, which immediately irritated Thornton, since he'd been solving implementation challenges for 6 weeks, while Brooks had apparently been writing reports about them. Manufacturing these modifications at scale requires coordination with existing contractors, formal part specifications, quality control procedures, and integration with depot-level maintenance systems. Every requirement the general listed was reasonable in isolation, but collectively represented the bureaucratic complexity that had prevented the modifications from being implemented through official channels in the first place. Thornton recognized the pattern. The system that had rejected his ideas when they were inconvenient now wanted to recapture control over their implementation, wrapping practical solutions in layers of procedure that would slow everything down while ensuring proper people received proper credit. "General Brooks," Thornton interrupted with the bluntness that comes from no longer caring about political consequences, "we've already retrofitted over 800 trucks using field procedures that bypass every system you just mentioned. The modifications work because we didn't wait for all those coordination procedures." The room's atmosphere shifted uncomfortably. Civilian contractors didn't interrupt generals, and they certainly didn't criticize military procedures in formal briefings. But Thornton had crossed enough lines already that one more seemed insignificant. "The trucks we've modified," he continued, "have failure rates that are 40 to 50% lower than standard vehicles. Drivers are safer, supplies are reaching front lines faster, and the Red Ball Express is accomplishing missions that were failing 3 weeks ago. If we pause to implement all your coordination procedures, people die while we're documenting proper process." Major Vincent Callahan, who'd initially questioned Thornton's qualifications during their first meeting in Detroit, spoke up with surprising support. "General, Mr. Thornton's field implementation has proven remarkably effective. Perhaps we should consider formalizing what's already working rather than redesigning it to fit existing systems." Coming from Callahan, who'd built his career navigating military bureaucracy, this suggestion carried weight that Thornton's blunt statements lacked. It represented insider acknowledgement that sometimes the system needed to adapt to solutions rather than forcing solutions to conform to systems. General Brooks considered this diplomatic reframing before responding.